Tonight we drift into the shadowed corners of history, into rooms where the air still carries the faint scent of beeswax and yesterday's tea, where footsteps echo on cold stone floors, and where thousands of young women lived lives hidden behind velvet curtains and polished brass. This is the world of the Victorian maid, the invisible hands that kept grand mansions running, the silent witnesses to secrets, scandals, and the daily theater of upper-class life. These were not the romanticized figures of period dramas, but real women who woke before dawn, worked until their hands bled, and dreamed of something better while scrubbing someone else's floors. So before you settle deeper into your pillows, if you enjoy drifting through these forgotten stories of history, consider joining us for more tales from the past. Now, let the world outside fade away. Close your eyes if you wish, and step with me into a mansion where the clocks tick slowly, the stairs creak with memory, and the ghosts of 1,000 maids still move through the darkness, carrying their burdens with quiet grace. The year is 1875, and you are waking in a narrow attic room where frost patterns the inside of the window and your breath makes clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. The maid's bell has not yet rung, but your body knows the rhythm so deeply that you wake anyway, pulled from dreams by the internal clock that servitude has wound tight within you. Around you, other maids sleep in their narrow beds, curled against the cold, their faces peaceful in these final moments before the day claims them. You move carefully in the darkness, feeling for your uniform laid out the night before, still stiff with starch, still holding the shape of yesterday's labor. The floorboards are ice beneath your bare feet, and somewhere far below you can hear the first stirrings of the house, the distant clank of the kitchen range being lit, the soft footsteps of the scullery maid who rises even earlier than you, condemned to the lowest rung of the household ladder. There is no mirror in this room, nothing to reflect your face or remind you of your individuality. You dress by feel and memory, fingers working buttons and hooks with practiced efficiency, tying your apron strings with a knot you could accomplish in your sleep, which sometimes you have. Your hair must be tamed, pinned back so severely that your scalp aches, because loose hair is slovenly, and slovenly is the worst accusation that can be leveled at a maid. You are creating the uniform self, the invisible servant who will move through the mansion like a shadow, present but never truly seen, essential but never acknowledged. Outside the attic window, the city is still dark, gas lamps flickering in the streets far below, and you wonder, not for the first time, about the lives of those who sleep in soft beds with warm blankets, who wake to breakfast brought on trays, who have never felt the bite of cold water on raw hands at 5 in the morning. Down the back stairs you go, moving with the careful silence that has become second nature, because noise is transgression, and transgression means trouble. The stairs are narrow and steep, designed to hide the servants' movements from the family's view, and you have learned every creaking board, every loose nail, every place where the banister wobbles dangerously. These are the arteries of the house that the family never sees, the hidden passages and back corridors where the real work happens, where the machinery of domestic life grinds on endlessly. In the kitchen, warmth from the range is beginning to spread, and the cook is already at work, her face flushed, her hands moving with the confidence of long practice. She nods at you, a brief acknowledgement, and you take your place in the complex choreography of the morning, each servant knowing their role, each task completed in a sequence as precise as any military operation. The fires must be lit in every room before the family wakes, and this is your first task, the one that sets the stage for everything that follows. You fill the coal scuttle, feeling the weight of it pull at your shoulders, and begin your rounds through the sleeping house. Each fireplace has its own personality, its own quirks and demands. The drawing room fire draws well, but eats coal like a hungry beast. The master's study requires careful arrangement of kindling, or it smokes and fills the room with acrid clouds. The nursery fire must be gentle, warm, but not too hot, because children are delicate and must be protected even from the heat that comforts them. You kneel before each hearth, your hands blackening with coal dust, your knees aching against hard floors, and you build these small infernos that will make the mansion habitable, that will drive back the cold and create the illusion of comfort that the family takes entirely for granted. As you work, the house begins to wake around you. You hear doors opening on the floors above, the soft murmur of voices, the rustle of fabric as the family stirs in their beds and rings for their morning tea. The bells begin their symphony, each one a summons, each one a command that must be answered immediately. You have learned to distinguish between them, to know by the pitch and duration which room is calling, which member of the family requires attention. The mistress's bell is imperious and sharp, the master's is brief and businesslike. The children's bells ring with chaotic enthusiasm, as if pulling the cord is a game rather than a communication. You move faster now, your carefully built routine disrupted by the unpredictable demands of those upstairs, and you feel the familiar tension building in your chest, the fear that you will be too slow, that you will fail to meet expectations, that today will be the day when your inadequacy is finally exposed. Hot water must be carried upstairs, heavy jugs that slosh and threaten to spill with every step, and you have become an expert in balance and momentum, tilting the jug just so to prevent disaster. The hallways are still dim, lit only by the pale light filtering through windows, and the family portraits watch you pass with their painted eyes, generations of privilege observing the latest in a long line of servants who have carried water and coal and trays through these same corridors. You wonder sometimes if the faces in the paintings remember the names of those who served them, or if servants were always invisible, always interchangeable, always just the help. In each bedroom, you place the jug carefully, making no sound, disturbing nothing, and then you withdraw like smoke, leaving no trace of your presence except the water that steams gently in its porcelain prison. The chamber pots are waiting, and this is the task that no one speaks of, the necessary horror that defines the reality of Victorian plumbing, or rather the lack of it. You steel yourself, adopting the blank expression that you wear like armor, and you collect these vessels of human waste with as much dignity as you can muster. There is an art to carrying them without spilling, without drawing attention, without allowing your face to betray any reaction to the contents. You have learned to breathe through your mouth, to think of other things, to transport your mind elsewhere while your body completes this degrading task. Down to the scullery you go, to empty and rinse and scrub, and you are grateful that at least this work is done in relative privacy, away from the eyes of the family, in a space where you can drop the pretense of serene competence and simply grimace at the unpleasantness of it all. But there is no time to linger in disgust, because the morning is advancing rapidly now, and breakfast must be prepared and served. In the kitchen, organized chaos reigns as the cook orchestrates the production of eggs and toast and bacon, of tea brewed to exact specifications, of porridge that must be neither too thick nor too thin. You assist where needed, carrying plates to the dining room, ensuring that everything is arranged with geometric precision, that the marmalade is in its proper place, and the butter dish is filled, and the napkins are folded just so. The family descend at their leisure, never hurrying, never acknowledging the hours of labor that have preceded this moment, and they seat themselves at the table with the casual confidence of those who have never doubted that breakfast will appear, hot and perfect, exactly when they desire it. You stand by the sideboard, hands folded, eyes downcast, a statue in black and white, and you wait for the inevitable requests. More tea, fresh toast, another serving of eggs, the butter passed, the jam retrieved, the constantly shifting demands that turn breakfast service into an endurance test. The master reads his newspaper, the rustling of pages the only sound besides the soft clink of silverware on china. The mistress nibbles at her food with the delicate disinterest of someone who has never known true hunger. The children squirm and complain and push food around their plates, and you watch them waste more in one meal than you might eat in a week, and you feel nothing, because feeling is dangerous, because resentment is the first step toward insubordination, and insubordination is the first step toward unemployment. When breakfast is finally finished and the family disperses to their various occupations, you clear the table with swift efficiency, stacking plates, gathering silverware, collecting the debris of the meal. Back to the kitchen you go, where the scullery maid is already elbow-deep in washing up, and you add your burden to hers, knowing that your own hands will soon be submerged in water so hot it scalds, scrubbing at grease and food residue until your knuckles are raw. But this is the rhythm of the day, the endless cycle of preparation and service and cleaning, and you have learned not to think about how many more hours remain, how many more tasks must be completed before you can finally rest. The house must be cleaned, every surface dusted, every floor swept, every piece of brass polished until it gleams. You move through the rooms with your feather duster and your cloths, erasing the evidence of human occupation, restoring the mansion to its pristine state. Dust is eternal, an enemy that can never be truly defeated, only temporarily subdued, and you have developed a philosophical relationship with it, accepting that tomorrow it will return, that this battle is one you will fight every day for as long as you remain in service. The drawing room is particularly challenging, filled with delicate objects and uncomfortable furniture, with surfaces that seem designed to collect dust and display it prominently. You dust the mantelpiece, the side tables, the countless decorative objects whose purpose remains mysterious to you, and you try not to think about the fact that no one will notice your work unless you fail to do it. Polishing is meditation and torment combined. The repetitive motion of cloth against metal, the gradual emergence of shine from tarnish. Silver must be polished weekly, a task that leaves your hands black and your arms aching, but the butler inspects each piece with the intensity of a jeweler examining diamonds, and anything less than perfection is unacceptable. You polish candlesticks and tea services and flatware, and you wonder who decided that silver was the appropriate material for household goods. What sadist looked at a soft metal that tarnishes constantly and thought, yes, this is what we should eat from? But yours is not to question why. Yours is only to polish and scrub and make everything shine as if it were new, as if the passage of time and the touch of human hands had left no mark at all. The stairs are everywhere, unavoidable, the bane of every servant's existence. Victorian mansions seem to have been designed by architects who believed that horizontal space was somehow cheating, that true grandeur could only be achieved through vertical excess. You climb and descend dozens of times each day, carrying coal scuttles and water jugs and linens, and your legs burn with the effort. Your knees protest with increasing volume as the day progresses. The grand staircase is for show, wide and carpeted and lined with portraits, but the back stairs are your realm, narrow and steep and treacherous, with steps that vary in height and width as if crafted by someone who had never actually used stairs before. You have stumbled more times than you can count, have caught yourself on banisters, have said prayers of gratitude that you have never actually fallen, because a fall would mean injury, and injury would mean inability to work, and inability to work would mean dismissal without references. Midday brings a brief respite, a chance to catch your breath and perhaps even sit for a few minutes in the servants' hall. Here, the hierarchy is visible and enforced, with the butler and housekeeper at the head of the table, the senior staff arranged by rank, and the junior maids clustered at the far end like afterthoughts. The meal is simple, often the leftovers from the family's breakfast, and you eat quickly, knowing that the afternoon will bring its own demands. Conversation is subdued, careful, because the wrong words overheard can lead to trouble, and trust is a commodity carefully rationed in a household where everyone depends on everyone else, but no one is truly safe. You exchange glances with the other maids, silent communication that speaks volumes, and you take comfort in the knowledge that you are not alone in this, that others understand the particular exhaustion that comes from being constantly visible and constantly invisible at the same time. The afternoon stretches ahead, filled with more cleaning, more fires to tend, more bells to answer. The mistress receives callers in the drawing room, and you serve tea with mechanical precision, placing cups and saucers and plates of biscuits, and you become part of the furniture, a moving piece of the room's decoration that the ladies ignore completely while they gossip about people you will never meet and events to which you will never be invited. You hear fragments of conversation, scandal and speculation delivered in hushed tones, and you file these away in your memory, because information is currency below stairs, because knowing the family's business makes you valuable, makes you essential, even as it reminds you how separate your world is from theirs. As the light begins to fade, preparations for dinner begin, and this is the most complex operation of the day, requiring coordination between kitchen and dining room, between cook and butler, between all the servants who must work together to create the illusion of effortless abundance. The table is set with mathematical precision, each piece of silverware placed exactly so, each glass positioned at the correct angle, the whole arrangement a testament to order and control. You help carry dishes from the kitchen, hot plates of food that must be delivered at exactly the right temperature, and you stand ready to serve, to pour wine, to clear plates, to respond to every gesture and glance from those seated at the table. Dinner service is theater, a performance in which you are both stagehand and prop, and you have learned your role so thoroughly that you could do it in your sleep, which is fortunate because by this point in the day you are so tired that you are practically sleepwalking anyway. When dinner is finally over and the family retires to the drawing room for their after-dinner entertainments, you face the mountain of washing up, the seemingly endless parade of dishes and glasses and serving pieces that must all be cleaned and dried and put away. Your hands, already raw from the morning's labors, plunge once more into hot water, and you scrub mechanically, your mind elsewhere, thinking of home perhaps, or of the bed that awaits you, or of nothing at all, just blessed emptiness. The kitchen is warm and steamy, and the other maids work alongside you, and sometimes someone hums a tune or tells a joke, and for a moment the burden lightens, the camaraderie of shared suffering making everything slightly more bearable. But the day is not over, not yet, because the fires must be banked for the night, the lamps must be extinguished, the house must be prepared for sleep. You make your final rounds, checking that everything is secure, that no candles are left burning, that all is in order for the morning. The mansion in darkness is a different place, full of shadows and strange sounds, and you move through it with a mixture of familiarity and unease, because you know every room, and yet you never truly belong here. You are always a visitor in someone else's domain. Up the back stairs one last time you climb, each step an effort now, and you reach the attic room where you began, where the other maids are already preparing for bed, changing out of their uniforms with relief, letting down their hair, becoming themselves again for the few hours until the morning bell summons them back into service. You lie in your narrow bed, the thin blanket pulled up to your chin, and you feel the ache in every muscle, the throb of your feet, the sting of your hands. Around you, the house settles into its nighttime groans and whispers, and you drift toward sleep with the knowledge that tomorrow will be exactly the same. Another day of bells and stairs and endless tasks. Another day of being invisible and essential. Another day of surviving in this strange world where you live in a mansion but own nothing. Where you are surrounded by luxury but touch it only to clean it. Where you are part of a family that does not know your name. And yet, in the darkness, you hold on to the small victories, the tasks completed, the disasters avoided, the moments of laughter shared with the other maids, and you tell yourself that this is temporary, that someday things will be different, that someday you will have a life of your own, a home of your own, a name that belongs to you and not to your position. The dreams come softly, fragments of memory and hope tangled together, and in your dreams you are sometimes home, sometimes somewhere you have never been, sometimes someone other than a maid in a black dress with a white apron. In your dreams you are free, and the bells cannot reach you, and your hands do not hurt, and you wake when you choose to wake, not when duty demands it. But even in sleep, part of you remains alert, listening for the bell, ready to respond, because you are a Victorian maid, and you have learned that you are never truly off duty, never truly safe, never truly your own. This is the hidden world behind the grand facades, the reality that visitors never see, the labor that makes leisure possible, the sacrifice that enables comfort. This is the world of the pretty maids, who were neither particularly pretty nor particularly celebrated, who worked until their bodies failed and their spirits bent, who held families and households together with their bleeding hands and breaking backs. And as you finally surrender to exhausted sleep, as the mansion falls quiet around you, as the clocks tick toward another dawn, you are already dreaming of the morning, already preparing yourself for the bell that will ring too soon, already marshaling your strength for another day in service. Because this is your life now, this is what you do, this is who you have become in this house of secrets and silence, in this mansion where you are everything and nothing, where you see all and are seen by none, where you are the invisible force that keeps the visible world spinning. Sleep well, tired maid, for tomorrow the bells will ring again, and you will rise again, and you will do it all again, because survival is endurance, and endurance is victory, and sometimes the greatest triumph is simply making it through another day with your dignity intact and your hope still flickering, however faintly, in the darkness. The secret language of the servants is spoken not with words but with glances, with the arch of an eyebrow, with the tiniest movement of lips that might be a smile or might be a warning. You have learned this language out of necessity, because speech in the presence of the family is forbidden except in direct response to questions, and even then your words must be carefully measured, respectful, revealing nothing of your own thoughts or feelings. So you communicate in silence, a raised eyebrow asking if the other maid has seen the missing teaspoon, a slight nod confirming that yes, the housekeeper is in a foul mood today and everyone should be extra careful, a quick shake of the head warning that the mistress is approaching and all conversation must cease immediately. This silent vocabulary is rich and complex, developed over generations of servants who found ways to maintain connection and solidarity despite the rules designed to keep them isolated and subservient. In the servants' hall, when the day's work is finally done and you gather for the brief evening respite, the atmosphere changes. Here, below stairs, in the domain that belongs to you and your fellow servants, words flow more freely, though always with an undercurrent of caution, because you never know who might carry tales to the housekeeper, who might betray a confidence for the reward of favor with those in authority. You learn quickly who can be trusted and who cannot. You develop alliances and friendships within the strict hierarchy that governs servant life, and you navigate the complex social structure with the same care you bring to navigating the mansion's staircases. The cook is queen of the kitchen, her word law, her temper legendary, and you have learned to stay on her good side through small acts of deference and helpfulness. The butler rules the male servants and oversees the formal service. And though you rarely interact with him directly, you are always aware of his presence, his standards, his ability to make or break a servant's reputation with a few words to the master. The housekeeper is your immediate superior, the one who assigns your tasks and inspects your work and determines whether you are meeting the household's exacting standards. She is a woman who has risen through the ranks of service, who understands every job because she has done every job, and she expects perfection because she herself is perfect, or at least she presents that facade to the world. You both fear and respect her because she has power over your continued employment, but also because she represents what you might become if you survive long enough in service, if you prove yourself capable and reliable and willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of the household. Sometimes you watch her and wonder if she was ever young like you, if she ever dreamed of something beyond this life, if she ever resented the endless demands and the thankless labor, or if she has so thoroughly internalized the values of service that she no longer remembers any other way of being. Among the other maids, there is a complex mix of competition and cooperation. You compete for the better assignments, for the approval of those in authority, for the opportunity to advance within the household hierarchy. But you also depend on each other for survival, for help with tasks that are too difficult to manage alone, for companionship in a world where you are otherwise isolated from normal social life. The other maids know things about you that no one else knows. They have seen you at your worst moments, exhausted and crying and ready to give up, and they have offered comfort and encouragement, have shared their own struggles, have reminded you that you are not alone in this. These friendships are complicated by the fact that any of you might be dismissed at any time, that the maid who is your closest confidant today might be gone tomorrow, her bed stripped and her few possessions carried away, leaving only the memory of her presence and the increased burden of work distributed among those who remain. There are also the male servants, the footmen and the hall boys, and occasionally the valet and the groom, and their presence introduces another layer of complexity to life below stairs. Romance is officially forbidden, any involvement between servants grounds for immediate dismissal, and yet human nature persists despite the rules. You have seen the glances exchanged between the kitchen maid and the second footman, have noticed how the laundry maid always seems to find an excuse to be in the servants' hall when the hall boy is there, have been aware of the whispered conversations and the quickly stifled laughter that suggests something more than friendship. You yourself have felt the flutter of attraction, the dangerous pull towards someone who understands your life because he lives it too. But you have learned to suppress these feelings, to focus on survival rather than romance, because the risk is too great and the consequences too severe. The household runs on routines and rituals, on the precise repetition of tasks at specific times, and any deviation from these patterns is noticed and questioned. You rise at the same time every day, you follow the same sequence of duties, you eat at the same times and in the same places, and this predictability is both comforting and suffocating. It means you always know what is expected of you, but it also means there is no spontaneity, no freedom, no space for personal choice. Your life is not your own, it belongs to the household, and every moment is accounted for, every action prescribed. Even your rare days off, the precious few hours per month when you are allowed to leave the mansion, are circumscribed by rules about when you must return and what conduct is expected of you. You are never truly free, even in your free time, because you are always aware that you represent the household, that your behavior reflects on your employer, that any misstep could result in punishment or dismissal. And yet, within these constraints, you find small spaces for yourself, small acts of rebellion and independence that help you maintain your sense of self. You might pause for an extra moment at a window, looking out at the world beyond the mansion walls and imagining what it would be like to walk freely through those streets. You might slip an extra spoonful of sugar into your tea when the housekeeper is not looking, a tiny act of defiance that makes you feel briefly powerful. You might daydream while performing repetitive tasks, letting your mind wander to places you have never been and lives you will never live. And these mental escapes sustain you through the long hours of labor. You write letters home when you can afford the postage, carefully crafting words that will reassure your family that you are well without revealing the full truth of your circumstances, because you do not want them to worry, and because you need them to believe that your sacrifice, leaving home to work in service, was worth it. The passage of time in the mansion is marked not by calendar dates, but by the rhythm of the seasons and the annual events that define the household's year. Spring brings the dreaded spring cleaning, when every room must be taken apart and scrubbed and put back together, when curtains are washed and carpets are beaten and windows are polished until they are invisible. Summer brings garden parties and the additional work of serving outdoors, of carrying trays across lawns and managing linens in the heat, and dealing with insects and weather and all the complications of moving the household's operations beyond the familiar walls. Autumn brings the harvest of the kitchen garden and the endless work of preserving and pickling and preparing for winter, and you spend long hours helping the cook transform fresh produce into jars and bottles that will sustain the household through the cold months. Winter brings darkness and cold and the constant battle to keep fires burning and rooms warm, and you burn through coal and wood at an alarming rate, always carrying fuel, always tending flames, always fighting back the chill that seeps through walls and windows and seems to settle in your very bones. Christmas is both the best and worst time of year in the mansion. Best because there is a festive atmosphere, because the family is often in good spirits, because there are special foods and decorations, and sometimes even small gifts for the servants. Worst because the amount of work increases exponentially, because every surface must be decorated, and every meal must be special, and guests arrive and must be accommodated and served, and you work from before dawn until long after midnight, so exhausted that you can barely remember your own name. The mansion is transformed with evergreen boughs and ribbons and candles, and it does look magical, you have to admit, even as you are the one climbing ladders to hang decorations and cleaning up pine needles and ensuring that nothing catches fire. The family celebrates while you serve, and then, when they finally retire, you collapse in the servants' hall with the other staff, and someone produces a bottle of something warming, and you all drink a toast to survival, to making it through another Christmas, to the fact that you are still employed and still alive, and still capable of finding moments of joy, even in the midst of exhaustion. The hidden dangers of service are many and varied. There is the physical danger of heavy lifting and hot water and sharp knives and fires that can burn and stairs that can break bones. There is the danger of illness because you work in close quarters with others and diseases spread rapidly, and if you become too sick to work, you are a burden that the household cannot afford to carry. There is the danger of unwanted attention from male members of the household or their guests because you are vulnerable and powerless and have no recourse if someone decides to take advantage of your position. You have heard the whispered stories of maids who were dismissed when pregnancies became visible, sent away in disgrace while the men responsible faced no consequences. You have learned to make yourself as invisible as possible, to avoid being alone in rooms with men, to deflect any advances with quick thinking and careful words. But you know that safety is never guaranteed, that your virtue is constantly at risk in a world where you have no power and no protection. You begin to internalize the message that you are inferior, that your thoughts and feelings do not matter, that your only value lies in your ability to serve. You catch yourself apologizing for existing, for taking up space, for having needs and desires. You find it difficult to make eye contact with anyone who is not a servant. You automatically defer to others. You have trouble imagining a future in which you are not defined by your relationship to someone else's household. This is perhaps the deepest harm of service, this damage to the soul that is invisible but profound. This sense that you have been erased and replaced with the uniform you wear and the role you play. But you resist this erasure in small ways, every day. You remember your name, your real name, not just the generic girl or maid that the family calls you. You remember where you came from, the village or town or city that you left behind to come to this place. You remember your family, their faces and voices and the warmth of home. And you hold these memories close, protective of them, because they are proof that you existed before service and might exist after it. But you resist this erasure in small ways, every day. You remember your name, your real name, not just the generic girl or maid that the family calls you. You remember where you came from, the village or town or city that you left behind to come to this place. You remember your family, their faces and voices and the warmth of home. And you hold these memories close, protective of them, because they are proof that you existed before service and might exist after it. You maintain your identity in your mind even as you perform the role of perfect servant with your body, and this dual existence is exhausting but necessary, because to give up your sense of self entirely would be to lose something essential, something that even the harshest employment cannot quite extinguish. The years pass and you grow older in service, and you begin to understand things that were not clear when you first arrived. You understand that the mansion is not just a home, but a carefully constructed performance of wealth and status, and that your labor is what makes that performance possible. You understand that the family's comfort depends entirely on your discomfort, that their leisure is purchased with your toil, that the whole system rests on the exploitation of people like you who have no other options. You understand that this is not a natural or inevitable arrangement, but a choice, a social order maintained through tradition and law and the threat of poverty. And this understanding makes you angry, but you have learned to hide your anger, to smile and curtsy and say yes ma'am and no sir, while inside you are screaming at the injustice of it all. Some maids escape service through marriage, finding partners who can support them and allowing them to leave the mansion for homes of their own. Some save enough money over years of work to start small businesses, shops, or boarding houses, and they break free of service to become their own employers. Some simply endure, working until they are too old and too broken to continue, and then they are turned out with a small pension if they are lucky, and nothing at all if they are not, left to navigate a world that has little use for elderly former servants. You do not know which path your own life will take, whether you will find a way out or remain in service until the end, but you try to maintain hope, to believe that your current circumstances are not your permanent fate, to imagine that someday you will look back on these years as a difficult chapter in a longer story that includes happiness and freedom and a life lived on your own terms. As the night deepens and the mansion settles into silence, as you lie in your narrow bed surrounded by the soft breathing of the other maids, you think about all the women who have slept in this same room, who have worn the same uniform, who have climbed the same stairs and answered the same bells and scrubbed the same floors. They are ghosts now, their names forgotten, their stories untold. But they were real. They lived and worked and dreamed just as you do, and their labor is woven into the very fabric of the house. The polished banisters carry the memory of their hands, the clean floors testify to their hours of scrubbing, the smooth-running household is their legacy, though no one will ever acknowledge it. You are part of this invisible history, one more maid in an endless line of maids, and while your individual contribution may be forgotten, the collective labor of servants has shaped the world in ways that history books rarely recognize. Sleep finally claims you, pulling you down into dreams where you are sometimes still working, still carrying trays and climbing stairs and answering bells, because even your subconscious cannot entirely escape the patterns of waking life. But sometimes you dream of freedom, of open spaces and unlimited time, of a self that is not defined by service. And these dreams sustain you, giving you the strength to face another day when the bell rings in the pre-dawn darkness and summons you back to duty. The life of a Victorian maid is hard beyond measure, unjust beyond description. But it is also a testament to human resilience, to the capacity to endure, and even to find moments of joy and connection in the most difficult circumstances. You are stronger than you know, more resourceful than you realize, and though the world may not value your labor or recognize your humanity, you know the truth of your own worth, and that knowledge, however fragile, however embattled, is what allows you to rise each morning and face another day. And so the wheel turns, the seasons change, the years pass, and the mansion continues its elegant existence, its beauty maintained by hands that remain invisible, its comfort made possible by labor that goes unacknowledged. Behind every grand facade, there is a hidden world of work, and in every Victorian mansion, there are pretty maids, or at least maids who are called pretty, because the term has nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with the particular role they play in the household hierarchy. These are the women who dust the drawing rooms and serve the tea and clean the chamber pots and keep the fires burning, and they do it all while remaining as invisible as possible, present but not present, essential but not valued, human but not treated as fully human. This is their story, the one that is rarely told, the one that has been hidden behind velvet curtains and closed doors, but it is a story that deserves to be heard, because it is the story of millions of women whose labor built the world we inherited, whose sacrifice enabled the comfort of others, whose lives mattered even though they were treated as if they did not. So rest now, dear listener, and as you drift toward sleep, carry with you the memory of these women, these maids who worked until their hands bled and their backs broke, who maintained their dignity in the face of constant degradation, who found ways to laugh and love and hope even in the darkest circumstances. They are the invisible women of history, but they are not forgotten, not entirely, not as long as someone is willing to tell their story, to acknowledge their existence, to say that they were here, they mattered, they endured. Sleep well and dream of a world where labor is valued and workers are respected, where no one must sacrifice their humanity for survival, where the mansions of the future are built on foundations of justice rather than exploitation. The pretty maids of the Victorian era have passed into history, but their legacy remains, a reminder of what humans can endure and a challenge to build a better world for those who come after. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams be gentle and your rest be deep. Here in the quiet hours when the bells have finally fallen silent and the mansion, at last, is still. The seasons turn within the mansion's walls with a rhythm that is both predictable and exhausting, each change bringing its own particular torments and small mercies. You come to know the house not by the family's calendar of social events, but by the quality of light through the scullery window, by the temperature of the stone floors under your feet, by the way the wind howls down the chimneys, or the way the morning air smells when you empty the ashes from the grates. Winter is the cruelest season, when the cold seeps into your bones and never quite leaves, when your hands crack and bleed from the constant transition between icy water and scalding heat, when the fires you tend so carefully warm everyone except you because you are always moving, always in the drafty corridors and unheated passages where servants belong. The mansion in winter becomes a beast that must be constantly fed with coal and wood, its appetite insatiable, its demands relentless. You spend what feels like half your waking hours carrying fuel, hauling heavy scuttles upstairs that seem to multiply in the darkness, your shoulders aching with the weight, your breath coming in clouds that dissipate in the frigid air. The family complains if any room drops below a comfortable temperature, if any fire burns too low or smokes or fails to provide the perfect ambiance of warmth and cheer. But they never see the labor that goes into maintaining this comfort, never witness the armies of servants who work like stokers in the belly of a ship, feeding the fires that keep the cold at bay. Your hands develop chilblains, painful swellings that itch and burn, and there is no remedy except to keep working, to keep plunging your damaged hands into cold water and hot water and the caustic cleaning solutions that make everything worse. Winter mornings are the darkest, when you rise in pitch blackness and dress by feel, when the attic room is so cold that ice has formed on the inside of the window and your breath creates frost in the air. You wrap yourself in whatever extra layers you can find, but the uniform allows for little variation, and besides, too many petticoats make it difficult to move quickly, and speed is essential in service. You learn to function while cold, to ignore the shivering, to push through the numbness in your fingers and toes, because the work must be done regardless of comfort, regardless of weather, regardless of how you feel. The kitchen becomes the only warm place in the servant's domain, and you find excuses to linger there when you can, standing near the range, absorbing its heat like a plant absorbs sunlight, storing up warmth for the next expedition into the frozen reaches of the house. But winter also brings moments of strange beauty, times when you catch your breath at the sight of frost patterns on windows, at the way snow transforms the familiar garden into something magical and unknown. You stand for a stolen moment, watching snowfall in the lamplight, and you feel something in your chest that might be joy, or might be sorrow, or might be both together. This recognition of beauty in the midst of hardship, this stubborn capacity for wonder, even when you are exhausted and cold and your hands hurt and your future is uncertain. These moments do not make the labor easier, but they remind you that you are still capable of feeling something beyond weariness, still able to see the world as more than just an endless series of tasks to be completed. Spring arrives not with flowers, but with the dreaded announcement of spring cleaning, words that strike terror into every servant's heart. This is the season when the entire house must be taken apart and reassembled, when every object must be removed and cleaned and polished and returned to its exact place, when the very walls must be scrubbed and the ceilings swept free of cobwebs and the windows washed inside and out until they are invisible. The work begins in early March and continues for weeks, disrupting all normal routines, requiring every hand, testing the limits of endurance and patience. The housekeeper produces lists that seem to grow longer each time you look at them, and she patrols the house with the determination of a general inspecting troops, finding fault, demanding perfection, accepting no excuses. Carpets must be rolled up and carried outside, beaten until no more dust emerges, which in a Victorian mansion means beaten for hours until your arms feel like they might fall off. Curtains must be taken down, and this is a precarious operation involving ladders and hooks and yards of heavy fabric that fights you every step of the way, threatening to pull you off balance, to smother you in dusty velvet or brocade. Everything must be washed, the curtains soaked in enormous tubs and scrubbed and rinsed and hung to dry, taking days to complete. And if the weather is uncooperative, if it rains during spring cleaning, the whole operation becomes a nightmare of damp fabric and mildew and the housekeeper's increasing frustration. Furniture must be moved so that the floors beneath can be cleaned, and Victorian furniture is constructed of solid wood and weighs approximately as much as a small carriage, and you and the other maids must drag these monstrosities across rooms, trying not to scratch the floors, trying not to injure yourselves, trying to remember exactly where each piece belongs so that the family will not notice any changes. The worst task of spring cleaning is washing the walls. Every wall in every room must be wiped down with special solutions, and you stand on ladders reaching up until your neck and shoulders scream in protest, wiping and wringing and wiping again, watching years of accumulated dirt and smoke transfer from wall to cloth. Your arms ache, your back spasms, and still there are more walls, endless walls, the house revealing itself to be far larger than you had imagined when you are the one responsible for cleaning every square inch of it. The ceilings must be swept with long-handled brooms, dislodging spiders and their webs, and you try not to think about what might be falling on you as you work. Try not to flinch when something brushes against your face, because flinching might mean losing your balance, and falling from a ladder would be disastrous in ways both immediate and long-term. Windows are their own special torment during spring cleaning because they must be perfect, absolutely streak-free, clean enough that birds might fly into them, mistaking them for open air. You mix solutions of vinegar and water, you scrub and polish and buff, and still the housekeeper finds smudges, streaks, imperfections that must be corrected. You learn to clean windows in specific patterns, to check them from multiple angles, to pray for cloudy days when flaws are less visible, and you develop a hatred for windows that is deep and abiding because there are so many of them, enormous Victorian windows that let in light and let everyone see your failures if you do not clean them properly. Your reflection looks back at you from the glass and you barely recognize yourself, this thin, tired girl with her hair pulled back too tightly and her dress stained with cleaning solutions, and her expression somewhere between determination and despair. But spring cleaning does eventually end, and when it does, there is a sense of collective accomplishment among the servants, a feeling that you have survived something significant, that you have proven yourselves capable of extraordinary effort. The house gleams in a way it does not at any other time of year, and even though you know that dust and dirt will begin accumulating immediately, that within weeks the visible evidence of all this labor will have faded, there is still pride in what you have achieved. The family comments approvingly on how fresh everything looks, and the mistress might even compliment the housekeeper, who in turn might offer a few grudging words of acknowledgement to the staff, and you accept these crumbs of recognition as the feast they represent, because praise is rare and therefore precious in the world of service. Summer brings its own challenges, though they are different in character from winter's cold or spring's chaos. The mansion in summer is stuffy and close, the heavy curtains that keep out winter drafts now trapping heat, the fires that must still be lit for cooking, turning the kitchen into something resembling a foundry. You sweat through your uniform, the heavy black fabric clinging to your skin, the starched apron wilting despite your best efforts to keep it crisp. The family complains about the heat while doing nothing to generate it, while you labor over stoves and carry hot water and iron linens with irons heated to temperatures that could brand flesh. And the irony of this is not lost on you, though you would never voice it aloud. Flies become a constant nuisance, invading the kitchen, landing on food, requiring constant vigilance, and the use of fly papers that hang from ceilings, sticky and disgusting, and moderately effective. The family often decamps to their country house or to the seaside during the hottest months, and those left behind to maintain the townhouse experience a strange mixture of relief and increased burden. Relief because the family's absence means fewer bells ringing, fewer immediate demands, a slightly more relaxed atmosphere below stairs. Increased burden because this is when major projects are undertaken, repairs and painting and deep cleaning that cannot be accomplished while the family is in residence. And there is always a skeleton staff left behind, and you might be part of this group, chosen to stay while others accompany the family or take their own brief holidays. And you feel the unfairness of this, the way your life is determined by the needs and whims of others, the way you have no control over your own time or choices. Garden parties in summer are spectacles that require enormous preparation and generate enormous work. The family decides to entertain outdoors, and suddenly you are carrying furniture into the garden, setting up tables and chairs on the lawn, transporting china and glassware and linens across uneven ground, praying that nothing will be dropped or broken. You serve lemonade and tea and elaborate cakes, and you battle wasps that are attracted to the sweet offerings, and you try to maintain your composure while sweat runs down your back and the sun beats down mercilessly. The family and their guests lounge in the shade, dressed in white and pastels, looking effortlessly elegant, while you and the other servants move among them in your dark uniforms, nearly invisible except when needed, suffering from the heat but required to appear cool and unaffected. Thunderstorms in summer bring a different kind of chaos, sudden downpours that threaten any outdoor events, that send you scrambling to rescue furniture and food, that turn gardens into mud and create tracked footprints through the house that must be immediately cleaned. But storms also bring blessed coolness, temporary relief from oppressive heat, and you stand at the scullery door during a lull in your work and watch the rain fall and smell the earth and feel the temperature drop. And for a moment you are grateful for the small mercy of weather that cannot be controlled even by the wealthy. Lightning illuminates the mansion in stark flashes, thunder rattles windows, and you are reminded that nature is more powerful than any household, that there are forces in the world that do not care about polished silver or starched linens or the elaborate rules of Victorian society. Autumn is perhaps the most beautiful season, even you must admit this, when the trees in the square turn gold and red and the air requires a crispness that is invigorating after summer's humidity. But autumn also means preparing for winter, laying in supplies, preserving the harvest, readying the house for the cold months ahead. The kitchen becomes a factory of preservation, and you are conscripted to help with endless peeling and chopping and stirring, transforming fresh produce into jams and chutneys and pickles that will be stored in the larder. Your hands are stained purple from berries, yellow from turmeric, and they burn from the vinegar used in pickling, and the cook rules her domain with increased intensity during this season, because there is so much to do and limited time to do it, and the family's comfort through the winter depends on the success of these efforts. Apples must be picked and sorted, the best ones wrapped individually and stored in the cool cellar, the damaged ones transformed into sauce or pie filling. Pears must be preserved in syrup, plums must be transformed into jam, and every batch must be properly sealed or it will spoil, wasting precious resources and inviting the cook's wrath. You learn the chemistry of preservation, the importance of sugar ratios and sterilization and proper sealing techniques, and you take a certain satisfaction in rows of filled jars, physical evidence of labor completed, tangible preparation for future needs. The work is repetitive and tedious, standing at the table for hours, performing the same motions again and again until your hands move automatically and your mind drifts elsewhere. But there is also something meditative about it, a rhythm that is almost soothing once you surrender to it. As autumn progresses toward winter, there is an increasing awareness that the year is dying, that darkness is gaining ground, that the brief reprieve of summer is over, and you are heading back into the hardest season. The fires must be cleaned and restocked, chimneys must be swept, windows must be sealed against drafts, and heavy curtains must be hung to keep out the cold. You help with all of this, and you feel the weight of the coming winter, the knowledge that you will soon be cold again, that your hands will soon hurt again, that the easy breathing of summer will give way to the chest-tightening coughs that afflict so many servants during the winter months. But you also know that you will survive, because you always have, because you are stronger than you sometimes believe, because giving up is not an option when survival depends on continuing. The approach of Christmas brings mixed feelings, excitement and dread intertwined. The mansion must be decorated, transformed into a vision of festive cheer, and this falls to the servants to accomplish. Evergreen boughs must be cut and brought inside, filling the house with the scent of pine and winter forest, and you spend hours winding them along banisters and around door frames, securing them with wire and ribbon, trying to achieve the perfect look that the mistress has described in increasingly elaborate instructions. Holly, with its sharp leaves and red berries, must be arranged carefully, both for aesthetic effect and to avoid the scratches that come from careless handling. Mistletoe must be hung in doorways, and you are aware of the tradition associated with this plant, aware that it creates opportunities for stolen kisses, and you are both hopeful and anxious about this, depending on who might take advantage of the tradition. The Christmas preparations seem to begin earlier each year, with lists appearing in November and the cooks starting to make puddings and mincemeat weeks before the actual holiday. The puddings must be made well in advance to allow them to mature, and everyone in the household must take a turn stirring the mixture while making a wish, a tradition that you participate in with a mixture of superstition and cynicism, wishing for things you barely dare articulate even in your own mind, wishing for change, for escape, for a better life, for love, for rest, for any of the 1,000 things that you lack and desire. The mincemeat for pies must be prepared and stored, and the scent of spices fills the kitchen, cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg, exotic and expensive, and used with a lavishness that seems almost shocking after the careful economy that governs most of the household's operations. As Christmas Eve approaches, the work intensifies to a nearly unbearable level. The house must be perfect, every surface gleaming, every decoration precisely placed, every meal planned and prepared with meticulous attention to detail. The family will host parties and entertain guests, and the servants must ensure that everything runs smoothly, that food appears as if by magic, that fires burn cheerfully, that the whole elaborate production unfolds without a single visible hitch. You work from before dawn until well after midnight, snatching minutes of rest when you can, sustained by weak tea and the increasingly distant hope that eventually this will be over and you will be allowed to sleep. Your feet ache with a deep, persistent pain that radiates up your legs. Your back feels like it might snap, and your hands are raw from constant washing and scrubbing and handling of hot dishes and cold silver. Christmas Day itself is a strange experience for servants, a day when the normal routines are disrupted, but the work is, if anything, more intense. The family wakes late and expects an elaborate breakfast. Then there is church, which requires additional preparations of clothing and transportation. Then there is the grand Christmas dinner, which is the culmination of weeks of planning and involves more courses than seem reasonable and requires every servant working at maximum capacity. You serve goose and turkey and ham. You bring vegetables and sauces and elaborate desserts. You pour wine and clear plates and try to maintain the serene, invisible presence that is expected, even though you are dead on your feet and want nothing more than to sit down for just 5 minutes. The family toasts and laughs and enjoys themselves, and you are happy for them in an abstract way, but mostly you are just tired, so tired that you feel like you might cry, though you do not, because crying is not permitted, because servants must not display emotion, because your feelings are not relevant to anyone except yourself. Late on Christmas night, after the family has finally retired and the last dishes have been washed and the kitchen has been restored to order, the servants gather for their own small celebration. The cook has saved some food for you, and someone produces a bottle of something warming, and you sit together in the servants' hall, too exhausted to do much more than smile at each other, sharing the exhausted camaraderie of those who have survived a battle together. The butler makes a small speech, thanking everyone for their hard work, and the housekeeper's face softens slightly, and for a brief moment the strict hierarchy relaxes, and you are all just people, tired people who have earned their rest. Someone sings a carol, and others join in, and the sound is thin and wavering but genuine, and you feel your throat tighten with emotion, with gratitude for this moment of community, with sorrow for everything you have sacrificed to be here, with hope that someday things might be different. The days between Christmas and New Year are strange and suspended, the house existing in a state of half celebration, half recovery. There are still guests and parties, but the frenetic energy of Christmas has passed, and there is a winding down quality to everything. You continue working, but perhaps with slightly less intensity, and you allow yourself to think about the year that is ending and the year that is beginning, and you wonder what it will bring. Will you still be here next Christmas, in this house, serving this family? Will you have found a better position, escaped to something easier or at least different? Will you have saved enough money to consider other options, or will you still be trapped in service with no visible path forward? These questions have no answers, and you try not to dwell on them, but they persist in quiet moments, reminders that your life is uncertain, your future unclear, your choices limited by circumstances beyond your control. Twelfth Night marks the official end of Christmas, and this means all the decorations must come down. Every evergreen bough and sprig of holly must be removed. Every ribbon must be taken away, and the house must be returned to its normal state. This is somehow sadder than putting the decorations up, this undoing of beauty, this return to ordinary life. You gather armfuls of dried evergreens, now brittle and dropping needles, and carry them outside to be burned or composted, and the scent of them is still pleasant but tinged with decay, a reminder that all things are temporary. The rooms seem bare and cold without their festive decorations, and you feel the weight of winter settling in more heavily now that there is no holiday to anticipate, nothing to break the monotony of the dark months ahead except the slow waiting for spring. But life in the mansion continues regardless of season, the endless cycle of tasks repeating with minor variations, and you settle back into the familiar routines with the resignation of someone who has learned that acceptance is easier than resistance. The days blur together, marked by bells and meals and the changing quality of light through windows, and you begin to feel that you have always been here, that your life before service was something that happened to someone else, a dream you had once and have half forgotten. This is perhaps the most insidious effect of service, this gradual erosion of your sense of a separate self, this slow process by which you become the role you play, until the maid in the black dress with the white apron is not a disguise you put on each morning, but the only identity you can clearly remember. Yet there are moments when something breaks through this numbness, when you catch sight of yourself in a mirror and are startled by your own face, when a letter from home arrives and suddenly you remember that there are people who know you by your actual name and not just as girl or maid, when you smell something that reminds you of childhood and you are overwhelmed by a wave of longing so intense it takes your breath away. These moments are both precious and painful, reminders that you are still yourself underneath the uniform, still capable of memory and desire and feeling, but also reminders of how far you are from home, how much you have sacrificed, how much of yourself you have had to set aside in order to survive in this place. You do not know whether these moments make the work easier or harder, whether remembering who you are is a source of strength or just another burden to carry alongside all the others. The relationships you form below stairs become your lifeline, the connections that make survival possible. There are the other maids, women at various stages of their own journeys through service, and you learn from them, trade advice and warnings, share the small rebellions and private jokes that make the days bearable. There is the older maid who has been with the family for 15 years, who knows every trick for avoiding the housekeeper's displeasure, who can predict the family's moods and needs with uncanny accuracy. And you watch her with a mixture of admiration and pity, wondering if you will still be here in 15 years, whether you will become like her, so thoroughly adapted to service that you cannot imagine any other life. There is the young maid who arrived just months ago, still making mistakes, still sometimes crying at night when she thinks no one can hear, and you try to help her, to offer the same kindness that was offered to you when you were new, though you are aware that you cannot shield her from the harsh realities she must learn to navigate on her own. There is the kitchen maid who makes you laugh with her imitations of the cook's pronouncements and her running commentary on the absurdities of household life, and these moments of shared laughter are like light breaking through clouds, brief but brilliant. There is the scullery maid at the very bottom of the hierarchy, who works harder than anyone for the least reward, and you try to be kind to her, even though kindness costs you nothing and changes nothing about her circumstances, because you remember what it felt like to be the lowest, to be the one everyone else could look down on. These women are not exactly friends. The circumstances of service do not allow for friendship in any traditional sense, but they are companions in hardship, fellow survivors, and you are bound together by the shared experience of service in ways that outsiders could never understand. And then there is the question of romance, always complicated, always dangerous, always tempting despite the risks. The rules forbid it, the housekeeper watches for it, the consequences of being caught are severe, but human nature persists regardless of rules. You find yourself noticing the second footman, the way he smiles, the way his presence makes your pulse quicken, and you tell yourself this is foolish, that nothing can come of it, that you are risking your position and your future for the sake of feelings that might be nothing more than loneliness and proximity. But you cannot quite suppress the hope, the daydreams of conversations that might happen, of hands that might touch in passing, of a future that might include something beyond endless work. You are careful, so careful, revealing nothing through your expression or your actions, but inside you are aware of him constantly, tracking his movements through the house, looking for opportunities to be in the same space, playing a game that is both thrilling and terrifying in its potential consequences. Sleep, when it finally comes each night, is not exactly rest, but more like unconsciousness, your body simply shutting down from exhaustion, and your dreams are strange mixtures of the day's events and deeper fears and longings. You dream of being lost in endless corridors, of bells ringing that you cannot locate, of falling down stairs that extend infinitely downward, of standing before the family unable to speak or move. But you also dream of home, of faces you have not seen in months or years, of meals shared around a table where you are not serving but eating, of conversations in which your opinion matters and your voice is heard. You dream of freedom, whatever that might mean, of a life in which you are not constantly watched and judged and corrected, in which your time is your own, and your choices are genuine choices rather than simply different forms of compliance. And sometimes, rarely, you dream of the future you dare to hope for, a small house of your own, a family, a life lived on your own terms, and you wake from these dreams with your face wet with tears, grieving for something you have never had and may never have, mourning a future that exists only in imagination. The passage of years in service marks you in ways both visible and invisible. Your hands, once soft, become rough and calloused, marked by burns and cuts and the corrosive effects of cleaning solutions. Your back develops a permanent ache from lifting and carrying. Your knees protest when you climb stairs. Your feet are misshapen from hours in ill-fitting shoes. But the deeper marks are internal, changes to how you see yourself and the world, adaptations that allow you to survive, but at a cost you are not always aware of paying. You become hypervigilant, always listening for bells, always watching for signs of displeasure, always anticipating needs before they are expressed. You learn to make yourself small, to take up as little space as possible, to move through the world apologetically, as if your existence is an imposition that must be constantly justified through usefulness. You internalize the message that you are inferior, that your thoughts and feelings are less important than those of the people you serve, and this message shapes you in ways you will carry long after you leave service, if you ever leave service. But you also develop strengths that you did not know you possessed, reserves of endurance and resilience that allow you to keep going when everything in you wants to stop. You learn that you can survive more than you thought possible, that pain and exhaustion and humiliation do not have to break you, that you can endure and still retain some core of yourself that remains intact. You discover a capacity for strategic thinking, for navigating complex social situations, for reading unspoken communication and responding appropriately. You become an expert in household management, knowing intimately how to keep a large establishment running smoothly, and this knowledge has value even if it is not recognized or rewarded. You forge bonds with other servants that are based on genuine understanding, on shared experience that creates solidarity, and you learn that support can come from unexpected places, that kindness can survive even in harsh environments. And perhaps most importantly, you maintain hope, however fragile, however battered by reality, however difficult to sustain in the face of daily evidence that your circumstances are unlikely to change. You hope that tomorrow will be better than today, that next year will bring opportunities, that eventually you will find a way to something different. You hope that the work you do matters even if it is not acknowledged, that your labor contributes to the world in ways that have value beyond what the family recognizes. You hope that you will be remembered, if only by the other servants, that your life will not pass entirely without trace, that you will have mattered to someone. This hope is not always strong enough to comfort you, not always sufficient to counter the weight of despair that sometimes threatens to overwhelm you, but it persists nonetheless, a stubborn flicker that refuses to be completely extinguished. As the night deepens and the mansion falls into its final silence, as the last lamp is extinguished and the last door is closed, you lie in your narrow bed and take stock of your life with the brutal honesty that only exhaustion allows. You acknowledge the hardships, the injustices, the ways in which your humanity is denied and your labor is exploited. You recognize that the system you serve is fundamentally unjust, that the comfort of the few is purchased with the suffering of the many, that your position is not natural or inevitable, but the result of social arrangements that could be different. But you also acknowledge your own strength, your survival, your refusal to be completely crushed by circumstances. You recognize that you are part of a vast, invisible army of working women whose labor has built and sustained civilization even as they have been excluded from its benefits and written out of its histories. You know that your story matters, even if no one is listening, even if no one records it for posterity, even if you are forgotten as soon as you are gone. And so you close your eyes one more time, surrendering to sleep and to dreams that carry you beyond the walls of the mansion, beyond the constraints of your position, into spaces where you are free and valued and whole. Tomorrow you will wake, and the bells will ring, and the work will begin again. But tonight, in this moment, you rest, you breathe, you exist as yourself. And that small victory, that maintenance of your own humanity in the face of forces designed to erase it, is perhaps the greatest triumph of all. Sleep now, Victorian maid. Sleep deeply and dream boldly, for you have earned this rest 1,000 times over. And though the world may not recognize your worth, you know it. And that knowledge, however hard won, is yours to keep forever. Hello, my dear friends. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing in the entrance of a cave carved deep into ancient stone, where the walls still carry the faint blackness of fires long extinguished. In that darkness, scattered among the ashes, lie small seeds crushed and charred, seeds that are not remnants of food nor fragments of fruit, but the earliest evidence of cannabis ever touched by human hands. These burnt offerings tell a story that stretches across millennia, a story of ritual and fear, of medicine and madness, of sacred smoke rising toward gods that humanity could not name but desperately needed to reach. Tonight, we wander through that story together, from the smoky caves of the Stone Age to the glowing dispensaries of the modern world, tracing the path of a plant that has been worshipped, outlawed, forgotten, and reborn more times than any empire could count. So before you settle too deeply into your pillows, if you find comfort in these journeys through history's shadows, consider joining us for more tales that drift between the forgotten and the familiar. Now, dim the lights around you, perhaps turn on a fan for that soothing background hum, and let us embark on this odyssey together tonight through the entire history of smoking weed. If one were to wander deep into the caves of the Stone Age, where firelight once danced against rough stone walls and the air was thick with the scent of survival, the atmosphere would still carry traces of something older than language itself. On those blackened walls, patches mark where fires once burned, not just for warmth or cooking, but for something far more mysterious. Tonight, we wander through that story together, from the smoky caves of the Stone Age to the glowing dispensaries of the modern world, tracing the path of a plant that has been worshipped, outlawed, forgotten, and reborn more times than any empire could count. So, before you settle too deeply into your pillows, if you find comfort in these journeys through history's shadows, consider joining us for more tales that drift between the forgotten and the familiar. Now, dim the lights around you, perhaps turn on a fan for that soothing background hum, and let us embark on this odyssey together tonight through the entire history of smoking weed. Among the ashes that archaeologists have carefully sifted through, small seeds lie crushed and charred, silent witnesses to humanity's first experiments with altered consciousness. They are not grains meant to nourish the body, nor the remains of fruit gathered for sustenance. They are cannabis seeds, burnt deliberately, their smoke inhaled by people who had no written prayers, no temples, no philosophy beyond the immediate need to survive another day in a world ruled by hunger, danger, and the relentless march of seasons. In the dim light of prehistory, these burnt seeds whisper a story of ritual born from curiosity, of fear softened by smoke, and of a strange search for peace in a landscape where peace was the rarest commodity of all. There were no scrolls to record what they felt, no prophets to interpret the visions that came, only the flicker of firelight casting shadows that danced like spirits across the cave walls, and the rise of smoke curling upward into the darkness above, carrying with it something that felt like connection to forces beyond human understanding. Those early humans, living in small tribes scattered across continents they did not yet know were continents, had little understanding of plants beyond the most basic categories of edible, poisonous, or useful for fuel. Their knowledge was built on observation and accident, passed down through gestures and grunts long before language could capture the subtlety of experience. Yet somehow, in the course of gathering plants and tending fires, they discovered something curious in the thick, fragrant smoke of cannabis. It dulled the senses in a way that felt different from exhaustion or sleep. It softened pain that otherwise gnawed constantly at bodies battered by the demands of survival. It made the mind drift into a haze that felt unlike ordinary rest, a state where the sharp edges of fear and hunger seemed to blur into something almost bearable. It was not medicine as we understand it today, measured and prescribed with precision, nor was it recreation as we imagine now, chosen deliberately for pleasure or escape. It was something in between, something that existed in the liminal space between necessity and mystery, a momentary reprieve from the relentless harshness that shaped every waking hour of their lives. It is almost amusing to think that humanity's first experiment with relaxation, with intentionally altering consciousness for reasons beyond immediate survival, might have begun with a group of exhausted hunters accidentally setting their future drug on fire while trying to stay warm through a long cold night. Archaeologists who study these ancient sites believe that the smoke was used during rituals where entire tribes gathered in circles around carefully tended fires, their faces illuminated by the orange glow, their eyes reflecting the flames that represented both danger and comfort. The flicker of those flames against the rough stone walls made shadows dance like spirits, like ancestors watching from beyond the veil of death, and the rising smoke was thought to carry messages to unseen powers that controlled the hunt, the weather, the fertility of the land. The smell of burning cannabis, though harsh and unfamiliar at first, became part of the ceremony itself, a scent that signaled the beginning of communion with something greater than the individual, something that connected the tribe to the world they could not control but desperately needed to understand. Without language sophisticated enough to explain the sensations they experienced, the experience itself became sacred. They breathed deeply, their eyes growing heavy, their hearts slowing to a rhythm that felt synchronized with the earth beneath them, as if touching a mystery that no one could name but everyone could feel. The ground of these caves still holds evidence of their experiments, small stones blackened with resin, fragments of burnt plant matter that scientists have analyzed to confirm what folklore had long suggested, that these fires were not meant only for warmth or cooking, but for something more deliberate, a kind of communication between humanity and the smoke that carried their consciousness towards something they understood as divine. Perhaps this was the first attempt to bridge the gap between the physical and the spiritual through intoxication, the first time human beings realized that altering their minds could feel like altering reality itself. The irony, of course, is that what began as a holy practice, as a ritual meant to connect people to gods and ancestors, would thousands of years later become a habit argued over by lawmakers, criminalized by governments, and fought over in courtrooms and parliaments across the world. In modern terms, it would be like discovering that humanity's first church, the very birthplace of religious experience, was also its first smoke lounge, a place where people gathered not just to pray, but to alter their consciousness in ways that made prayer feel more real, more immediate, more connected to the forces that governed existence. The act of burning itself carried deep meaning in those ancient times, because fire was not just a tool, but a symbol of life itself, a force that protected against the cold and the predators that prowled in darkness, a force that transformed raw meat into nourishment and hard seeds into fragrant smoke. To mix cannabis with fire was to merge comfort with mystery, practicality with transcendence, survival with spirituality, in a way that felt almost magical. The smoke lingered long after the flames died down, clinging to hair and skin, filling nostrils with its strange, calming scent, wrapping itself around the bodies of those who sat in the circle like an invisible blanket. It might have felt like a conversation between the living and the unseen, a dialogue conducted not in words but in breath, in the inhalation and exhalation that connected each person to the smoke and through the smoke to something beyond themselves. Or perhaps it was a small rebellion against fear itself, a way of saying that even in a world ruled by danger and death, there could be moments of calm, moments where the constant vigilance required for survival could be set aside, if only briefly, if only for the duration of the ritual. For a brief moment in the heart of those caves, surrounded by darkness and uncertainty, the world grew softer, quieter, almost bearable. The hunger that gnawed at their bellies seemed less urgent. The fear that tightened their chests seemed less overwhelming. The exhaustion that weighed down their limbs seemed less crushing. In that space, in that smoke-filled moment, they found something that would define the human relationship with cannabis for millennia to come. The sense that relief was possible, that peace was attainable, even if only temporarily, even if only through the inhalation of smoke that rose from seeds thrown onto fire. Of course, they had no words for pleasure or addiction, no concepts that could separate the experience into categories of good or bad, healthy or harmful. Their understanding of mind and body was instinct alone, a knowledge built on what worked and what did not, on what helped them survive and what threatened their survival. A burning seed that made the night seem shorter, that made the darkness feel less oppressive, that made the fear recede even slightly, was miracle enough. They did not question it, did not analyze it, did not debate its moral implications. They simply kept burning, perhaps without even knowing why, driven by an instinct that told them this smoke brought something valuable, something worth repeating. The smoke became tradition, woven into the fabric of their communal life. The tradition became belief, a conviction that the ritual mattered, that the smoke carried power. And belief became survival, because in a world where meaning was scarce and comfort even scarcer, the rituals that brought people together, that gave them a sense of connection to something greater than themselves, were as essential to survival as food and shelter. When the winds changed and the herds moved on, when the seasons shifted and the tribe had to follow, they left behind nothing but faint traces of ash for future ages to uncover, silent testimony to rituals whose meaning would be lost, but whose presence would endure. To imagine those people sitting by the fire, wrapped in animal furs against the cold, their faces lit by the orange glow that pushed back the darkness, their eyes half closed as the smoke filled their lungs and their minds began to drift, is to glimpse the beginning of something far larger than they could have understood, something that would shape human culture and consciousness for thousands of years to come. They did not know of chemistry, of cannabinoids and receptors, of the complex interactions between plant compounds and human neurology. They had no understanding of medicine in the way we define it, no concept of spirituality as a separate realm of experience. Yet in that act of lighting a fire, throwing seeds onto the flames, inhaling the smoke, and surrendering to the haze that followed, they opened a door that humanity would never close again, a door that led to altered states of consciousness, to religious experience, to medical treatment, to recreational use, to all the ways that humans would learn to use plants to change how they felt, how they thought, how they perceived the world around them. It still feels strangely intimate to picture the first spark of curiosity that connected the human mind to smoke, as if even then, in those dark caves with no language to describe what was happening, people were searching for a way to feel less alone in their own thoughts, less trapped in their own fears, less overwhelmed by the sheer difficulty of existence. Thousands of years later, long after those caves had been abandoned and forgotten, we can still trace the path of that smoke through every culture that followed, watching as it moved from continent to continent, from ritual to ritual, from one meaning to another. From priests and healers who saw in it a connection to the divine, to kings and emperors who used it to ease pain and induce sleep, to commoners and laborers who found in it a brief respite from endless toil, the same instinct returned again and again: the need to burn, to breathe, and to believe that something unseen could soothe the mind and soften the harsh edges of reality. What was once a ritual born of darkness, of fear, of the desperate search for meaning in a meaningless world, would spread across continents and centuries, dressed in new meanings and new rituals, but always carrying the same ancient comfort, the promise that relief was possible, that peace could be found, that the mind did not have to remain trapped in its own suffering. The caves remain silent now, their ashes cold, their fires long extinguished, their secrets buried under layers of time and sediment. Yet the story of those burnt seeds lingers in the archaeological record, whispering to anyone willing to listen that even in prehistory, even before the first cities were built or the first alphabets invented, humans were drawn to escape the harshness of life, if only for a few breaths of smoke rising toward the unknown, toward the darkness above the cave where the stars shone cold and distant and indifferent to human suffering. The first traces of cannabis remind us that curiosity and comfort have always walked together hand in hand, that the drive to explore altered states of consciousness is not a modern phenomenon or a cultural aberration, but something fundamental to the human experience. They show us that even before civilization emerged, before agriculture transformed nomadic tribes into settled communities, before writing allowed ideas to be preserved and transmitted across generations, people sought peace through what they could not explain, through experiences that transcended language and logic. And somewhere between firelight and darkness, between the known world of hunger and danger and the unknown world of spirits and ancestors, they found it, if only for a moment, if only for the duration of the smoke that hung in the air before dissipating into nothing. The smoke of the Stone Age still drifts faintly through history, thin and ancient and almost invisible, carrying the memory of the first human who felt calm for no reason at all, who experienced a loosening of anxiety that had no obvious cause, who discovered that consciousness itself could be altered, that the mind was not fixed but fluid, not imprisoned but capable of transformation. The earliest fires revealed more than warmth and light. They revealed desire, the fundamental human desire to feel different, to feel better, to feel connected to something beyond the narrow confines of individual existence. From those embers scattered on cave floors, belief was born, a belief in the power of plants, in the efficacy of ritual, in the possibility of transcendence. And with it came the first addiction disguised as devotion, the first human dependency on a substance that promised relief and delivered just enough to keep people coming back, again and again, generation after generation. Somewhere beyond the ashes of those ancient fires, a new age waited, an age where smoke would no longer rise in caves, but in temples and palaces, under the gaze of gods carved from stone and painted with gold, where the ritual would become religion and the plant would become medicine, where human understanding would grow more sophisticated, but the fundamental desire would remain unchanged. The ancient Chinese did not stumble upon cannabis by accident, did not discover it through random experimentation or lucky coincidence. It appeared carefully recorded in their earliest medical texts, those fragile scrolls and bamboo strips where observation and superstition were woven together into a tapestry of healing wisdom that would influence medicine for thousands of years. The plant was called ma, a word that meant numbness but also carried connotations of balance, of the restoration of harmony to a body thrown into discord by illness or injury. To those early physicians who studied the flow of energy through the body, who saw disease as an imbalance rather than an invasion, cannabis was both a medicine and a mystery, a substance that could dull pain, calm the spirit, and open the mind to a kind of clarity that seemed almost supernatural. Its roots ran deep into the philosophy of harmony that governed Chinese thought, the belief that the body was a landscape of energy flowing through invisible channels, and that every illness represented a disruption of that flow, a blockage or excess that needed to be corrected. Cannabis, with its curious power to quiet pain and relax tense muscles, was believed to restore balance between motion and stillness, between the active yang energy and the receptive yin energy that needed to exist in perfect equilibrium for health to be maintained. The oldest references to the plant appear in texts attributed to Emperor Shen Nung, the mythical father of Chinese medicine, who is said to have tasted hundreds of herbs to determine their medicinal properties, sometimes poisoning himself in the process, but always recovering to record his findings for future generations. He described cannabis as a remedy that could heal hundreds of diseases, from fever that burned through the body to forgetfulness that clouded the mind, from pain that made movement impossible to restlessness that prevented sleep. Later healers expanded on these observations, writing of the plant's ability to ease pain and soften the body into rest, to calm agitated spirits and quiet troubled minds. They did not know its chemical nature, had no understanding of how cannabinoids interacted with receptors in the brain and nervous system, knew only that it could make suffering fade into a distance where the mind no longer reached, where pain became something observed rather than experienced. It is oddly comforting to think that thousands of years ago, on the other side of the world, people were already inventing ways to take the edge off existence, to make life a little more bearable through the careful application of plant medicine, even if they did not understand the mechanisms by which that medicine worked. In the time of the great physician Hua Tuo, who lived during the late Han Dynasty and became legendary for his surgical skill, cannabis became a tool of surgical courage, a way to perform procedures that would otherwise be impossible due to the patient's pain and movement. His legend tells of mixing powdered cannabis into wine, creating a concoction that he called ma fei san, which translates roughly to cannabis boiling powder, and giving it to patients before surgery. Under its spell, patients would fall into a state of deep relaxation bordering on unconsciousness, their bodies growing still, their awareness of pain diminishing to the point where Hua Tuo could cut flesh, remove tumors, and mend internal injuries without hearing screams of agony. This was not anesthesia as modern science understands it, not a complete elimination of consciousness and sensation, but something more primitive and uncertain, a state that existed somewhere between waking and sleeping, between awareness and oblivion. Some patients never woke from that state, their systems unable to recover from the combination of surgery and sedation. Others awoke praising the miracle that had spared them the agony they had expected to endure. In a world without morphine or chloroform, without any of the sophisticated anesthetic agents that modern medicine takes for granted, this fragile mixture of wine and cannabis was the closest thing to mercy that surgery could offer, the only way to perform procedures that required the patient to remain still while their body was violated by knife and needle. Hua Tuo's use of cannabis marked a quiet revolution in medical thinking, a revolution that suggested pain could be managed rather than merely endured, that surgery did not have to be an act of torture that patients survived through sheer force of will. That belief alone, the notion that human intervention could spare people unnecessary suffering, placed him centuries ahead of his time, anticipating the development of anesthesia by more than 1,000 years. In modern comparison, it would be as if a field surgeon working in the Middle Ages had discovered general anesthesia using only herbs and intuition, while the rest of the world still relied on prayer and leather straps to keep patients from moving during surgery. His methods spread through stories more than through systematic teaching, passed from physician to apprentice in the oral tradition that preceded written medical texts. But the memory of his experiments endured long after his writings were lost and his formulas buried with him in a grave that has never been found. Beyond surgery, Chinese healers used cannabis to calm the mind and settle disturbed thoughts, to treat what they called excessive spirit, a condition where too much energy burned through the brain, causing restlessness, insomnia, and what we might today call anxiety or mania. They believed that cannabis cooled the heart in a metaphorical sense, not lowering body temperature, but reducing the intensity of emotional and mental disturbance, silencing the ghosts and demons that caused nightmares and intrusive thoughts. It was medicine for the unseen, for the soul as much as the body, for conditions that had no visible symptoms but caused suffering nonetheless. In a culture that valued order above chaos, that saw the ideal life as one of balance and moderation, this ability to bring stillness to an agitated mind was considered sacred, a power that connected the physician to the fundamental forces that governed existence. The body, like the empire itself, had to remain balanced between competing forces, and cannabis became one of the quiet guardians of that balance, a tool that physicians could use to restore harmony when internal storms threatened to tear the patient apart.
Merchants sold dried cannabis flowers and seeds in small cloth bags at herbal markets that filled the streets of major cities, where the air hung thick with the scent of roots and resins and leaves, each promising health, though none could guarantee safety. Each bundle of herbs came with instructions passed down through generations, recipes that combined cannabis with other plants to treat specific conditions, though the dosages were approximate at best. There were no scales precise enough to measure exact quantities, no standardized preparations that ensured consistency from batch to batch, no warnings written on labels to alert patients to potential dangers. A handful of cannabis seeds might heal one person's insomnia while causing confusion and disorientation in another. Yet people trusted their healers with a faith that seems almost incomprehensible to modern minds trained to demand clinical trials and statistical proof, and healers trusted what experience whispered through generations, building a system of medicine that was fragile and imperfect but somehow managed to help more people than it harmed. The plant's dual nature puzzled many scholars who tried to understand its properties and predict its effects. Some claimed it brought enlightenment, opening the mind to insights that would otherwise remain hidden, allowing philosophers and poets to see connections between ideas that normal consciousness kept separate. Others called it dangerous to the mind, warning that excessive use could blur memory, make the tongue heavy and unresponsive, turn laughter into confusion, and cause a kind of mental fog that made clear thinking impossible. The plant's dual nature puzzled many scholars who tried to understand its properties and predict its effects. Some claimed it brought enlightenment, opening the mind to insights that would otherwise remain hidden, allowing philosophers and poets to see connections between ideas that normal consciousness kept separate. Others called it dangerous to the mind, warning that excessive use could blur memory, make the tongue heavy and unresponsive, turn laughter into confusion, and cause a kind of mental fog that made clear thinking impossible.
It was medicine and poison in equal measure, its effects dependent on dose and circumstance and the individual constitution of the person taking it. Too much could blur memory and judgment, leaving patients unable to recall recent events or make sound decisions, slowing their reactions to the point where they became vulnerable to accidents and injury. But in moderation, in the careful doses prescribed by experienced physicians who knew how to balance benefit against risk, it was said to unlock deep calm and insight, to allow patients to rest in a way that ordinary sleep did not provide, to create a mental space where healing could occur. This tension between healing and harm, between medicine and intoxication, defined the plant's place in Chinese medical thought for centuries, creating a framework where cannabis was respected but not revered, used but not celebrated, always approached with the caution that any powerful substance demanded. To lose control of oneself was shameful in a culture that prized discipline and self-mastery above almost all other virtues. But to master the effects of the plant through careful dosing and proper preparation was considered a mark of wisdom, evidence that the physician understood the subtle balance between too much and too little that determined whether a medicine healed or harmed. To lose control of oneself was shameful in a culture that prized discipline and self-mastery above almost all other virtues. But to master the effects of the plant through careful dosing and proper preparation was considered a mark of wisdom, evidence that the physician understood the subtle balance between too much and too little that determined whether a medicine healed or harmed. Even within temples, where Buddhist and Taoist monks pursued spiritual enlightenment through meditation and ascetic practices, cannabis found a place, though its use was carefully regulated and surrounded by ritual. Monks burned small amounts in censers during meditation sessions, letting the smoke rise with their chants, twisting through beams of sunlight that cut across dim halls filled with the scent of incense and aged wood. They said the smoke cleared the mind of dust, using a metaphor that compared mental clutter to the physical dirt that accumulated in neglected spaces, helping them to glimpse truth without the pain and effort that usually accompanied deep meditation. The irony was profound and somehow perfect, that a plant used to escape the senses was also believed to sharpen them, that something that dulled ordinary awareness was thought to enhance spiritual perception. I cannot help but find it deeply human that even those who sought spiritual purity through renunciation and discipline, who gave up comfort and pleasure in pursuit of enlightenment, still found comfort in a bit of chemical assistance, in a plant that made the long hours of sitting meditation slightly more bearable and the insights slightly more accessible. Centuries passed like smoke dissipating in wind. Dynasties rose and fell in the pattern that defined Chinese history. Emperors built palaces that crumbled to dust, and through it all, the plant's reputation shifted like sand, never quite settling into a fixed position. Some emperors banned its use outside strictly controlled medical contexts, fearing its power to cloud judgment and undermine the discipline that held society together. Worried that widespread cannabis use would create a population too relaxed to defend the empire or too distracted to maintain the rigid social order that kept millions of people organized and productive. Others praised its benefits and ordered it cultivated in imperial gardens alongside other medicinal plants, recognizing that pain and insomnia afflicted even emperors, and that relief should be available to those who ruled as well as those who served.
Cannabis moved quietly through households and hospitals and pharmacies, through prescriptions written in elegant calligraphy on rice paper, and prayers whispered in temples where smoke rose toward heaven. It never quite disappeared, never faded from use entirely, despite periodic attempts to restrict or control it. But it also never became fully embraced by mainstream culture, never achieved the status of essential medicine that would protect it from criticism and prohibition. It occupied a middle space, neither forbidden nor celebrated, tolerated but watched, useful but suspect, always hovering at the edges of acceptability. Through all its transformations and reimaginings, through all the changing dynasties and shifting attitudes, the core of the relationship remained the same. Cannabis offered relief in a world where pain was constant and control was fragile, where illness struck without warning and recovery was never guaranteed. It represented a small triumph of the human desire to soften reality, to make life a little more bearable, even if only for a short while, to create moments of peace in the midst of chaos. The physicians who prescribed it did not think in terms of addiction or vice, did not conceive of drug abuse as a moral failing or medical condition. They thought only of suffering and how to ease it, of patients who could not sleep or could not move without pain, of minds torn apart by anxiety or depression, and they offered what tools they had, imperfect as those tools might be. The story of cannabis in ancient China reveals more than the birth of a medicine or the development of medical knowledge.
It shows us the first systematic attempts to understand the connection between mind and body, to recognize that mental suffering was as real and as worthy of treatment as physical pain, to see that the two were interconnected in ways that made separating them impossible. It demonstrates how deeply people feared pain, not just the physical sensation, but the existential suffering that came from living in bodies that hurt and minds that could not rest. The plant became a bridge between flesh and spirit, between what could be seen and measured and what could only be felt and described, between the material world of bones and organs and the immaterial world of thoughts and emotions. In the quiet rooms of healers where patients lay on wooden beds describing their symptoms, and in the smoky air of temples where monks sat in meditation seeking enlightenment, cannabis whispered the same promise it had whispered in Stone Age caves, that relief was possible if one dared to trust what could not be fully understood, if one was willing to surrender control in exchange for comfort, if one accepted that sometimes the path to healing required passing through states of consciousness that felt strange and unfamiliar. Cannabis entered Chinese history as a healer and remained as a companion to both body and belief, its smoke carrying not rebellion but reverence, not escape but endurance, not the desire to flee reality, but the need to make reality bearable. And though its meaning changed with time, shifting to accommodate new philosophies and new understanding, its purpose remained fundamentally unchanged across the centuries: to ease the unending ache of being human, to provide small moments of peace in lives filled with struggle, to offer hope that suffering did not have to be permanent or absolute. The ancient doctors saw more than a plant when they looked at cannabis. They saw a path to peace, a tool for restoring balance, a gift from nature that could help humanity bear the weight of consciousness. Their discoveries gave cannabis a sacred weight that would survive the fall of dynasties and the rise of new empires, that would carry across borders and oceans to influence medical systems far from China's boundaries. Yet beyond their temples and scrolls, beyond the careful observations recorded in medical texts that would be copied and recopied for generations, others would take this same plant and twist its use in new directions, finding in it not medicine but pleasure, not treatment but recreation, not balance but intoxication. Somewhere far from the empire's borders, in lands where different gods were worshipped and different philosophies governed life, new hands waited to light the same smoke for very different reasons, to discover their own meanings in the haze, to write their own chapters in the long history of humanity's relationship with this strange and powerful plant. In the heat and dust of ancient India, where the sun burned with an intensity that seemed almost divine, and the air shimmered with mirages that blurred the line between real and imagined, cannabis was not merely a plant, but a divine gift bestowed by gods who took pity on human suffering. It appeared in the sacred verses of the Vedas, those ancient hymns and philosophical texts that formed the foundation of Hindu thought, where sages wrote of 5 holy herbs that could bring happiness and liberation to those who used them properly. Among these sacred plants, bhang was called the herb of the gods, a bridge between mortal minds trapped in bodies and celestial understanding that transcended physical limitations. It was believed to be born from the body of the god Shiva himself, that wild and terrible deity who sat in eternal meditation atop mountains covered in snow, his throat blue from poison he had swallowed to save the world, his third eye closed to prevent its gaze from destroying creation. According to legend, Shiva drank bhang to stay calm during his meditation, to quiet the cosmic forces that churned within him, to maintain the stillness necessary for holding the universe in balance. To touch the plant was therefore to touch a fragment of the divine, to hold in human hands something that had originated in godly flesh. And to drink it was to taste serenity itself, to partake of the same substance that allowed a god to remain peaceful despite containing the power to destroy all existence. For thousands of years, cannabis became woven into the very fabric of Indian spiritual life, so deeply embedded that separating it from religion became impossible. Sadhus, those wandering monks who renounced worldly possessions and comforts in pursuit of enlightenment, carried cannabis in small clay pots during their pilgrimages across the subcontinent, mixing it into milk and water and spices to create a drink that cooled the body and quieted the restless chatter of thoughts that prevented meditation. The taste was bitter and earthy, the texture gritty with crushed plant matter, the effect gentle at first, but then deepening into a kind of trance where the boundaries of self seemed to dissolve. To them, this was not intoxication in the sense of losing control or becoming confused, but purification, a way to dissolve the illusion of separation between individual soul and universal consciousness, a means of achieving the goal that all spiritual practice aimed toward. The body would grow light as if gravity had loosened its grip. The mind would become heavy and slow as if thoughts were moving through water. And the soul, they said, would rise closer to truth, floating free of the anchors that normally kept it trapped in limited perception. It is somewhat amusing to imagine that enlightenment, in its earliest form, that ultimate goal of all spiritual seeking, may have begun not with years of austere discipline and self-denial, but with a sip of something that tasted like dirt mixed with devotion, like earth and heaven blended in a cup. During great festivals such as Holi, when colors filled the air and the normal rules of society were temporarily suspended in celebration of spring and renewal, cannabis took on a joyful form that had less to do with spiritual seeking and more to do with communal celebration.
The bang drink was shared among crowds in the streets, poured from large clay pots into small cups that passed from hand to hand, rich and poor, high caste and low, all drinking together in a rare moment of equality. It softened tempers that might otherwise flare in the chaos of celebration, turned strangers into friends through the simple act of sharing, gave courage to dance and sing and play without the self-consciousness that normally governed public behavior. It is somewhat amusing to imagine that enlightenment, in its earliest form, that ultimate goal of all spiritual seeking, may have begun not with years of austere discipline and self-denial, but with a sip of something that tasted like dirt mixed with devotion, like earth and heaven blended in a cup.
To refuse the drink was to refuse the spirit of celebration itself, to stand apart from the community at precisely the moment when community mattered most. Children watched as their elders laughed and swayed with a looseness that seemed almost magical. Their eyes glazed, not with the wildness of alcohol, but with a kind of peace, a gentleness that made them approachable in ways they normally were not. This was not vice but blessing, not debauchery but devotion expressed through the body's relaxation, a communal trance that wove the entire community together through shared chemistry and shared ritual. In temples dedicated to Shiva, which could be found in every village and city across India, priests prepared bhang with elaborate care, mixing the cannabis leaves and flowers with ghee and almonds and cardamom and honey, stirring the mixture slowly before sunrise while chanting prayers, creating something that was part food and part sacrament. The mixture was offered first to the deity, placed before statues of Shiva who sat cross-legged in eternal meditation, smoke from incense curling around the offering, before being distributed to worshippers as prasad, blessed food that carried the god's grace. The smoke of burning cannabis leaves also filled these temples, mingling with frankincense and sandalwood, creating an atmosphere so thick with fragrance that breathing itself became a form of worship. To inhale that smoke was to join the gods in their stillness, to forget for a moment the hunger and fear that defined mortal existence, to rest in the warmth of the sacred that seemed to emanate from the very walls. There was no shame in this act, no sense of transgression or moral failing.
It was prayer made physical, faith carried on breath, devotion expressed through the simple act of inhaling smoke that had been blessed and offered to the divine before being shared with humanity. In modern comparison, it would be like walking into a church and finding that communion included not just bread and wine, but a drink specifically designed to alter consciousness, to bring worshippers into a state where they could feel more directly connected to the divine presence they came to honor. The entire congregation sharing this substance together, young and old, men and women, all experiencing the same gentle dissolution of ego and anxiety that made the teachings about universal consciousness and divine unity feel not like abstract philosophy, but like lived reality. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell across the Indian subcontinent, cannabis became embedded in every level of society, from the highest philosophical discussions to the most practical daily concerns. Farmers used it to ease pain after long hours laboring in fields under a sun that showed no mercy, rubbing cannabis paste into aching joints and drinking weak bhang to help them sleep despite bodies that screamed with exhaustion. Soldiers drank it before battle to steady nerves that might otherwise fail, to find courage in the face of death, to achieve the kind of calm detachment that made it possible to stand firm when everything in their bodies told them to run. Healers prescribed it for sleeplessness that no amount of exhaustion could cure, for fevers that burned through the body without breaking, for conditions of the mind that had no visible cause but made life unbearable nonetheless.
Poets and mystics praised cannabis as a key to understanding existence itself, as a substance that could unlock doors of perception that normally remained sealed, allowing glimpses of truth that ordinary consciousness kept hidden. It was medicine and comfort and revelation bound together in one green leaf, existing simultaneously in all these roles without any sense of contradiction. The line between religion and recreation was never drawn clearly in Indian culture, never codified into law or doctrine because the entire framework of understanding was different. Life itself was seen as a kind of illusion, a dream from which one needed to awaken, and anything that helped pierce that illusion, anything that revealed the temporary and constructed nature of everyday reality was potentially valuable. To live was to endure suffering. That was the fundamental teaching of the Buddha, and it echoed through Hindu thought as well. And to endure was to seek relief, whether that relief came from gods or herbs or rituals or meditation. The methods mattered less than the goal, which was always the same: to find peace in a world that offered precious little of it, to achieve moments of clarity and calm in the midst of chaos and suffering. The connection between cannabis and Shiva gave the plant a moral protection that made it almost impossible to prohibit or condemn. When challenged by outsiders who came to India and were shocked by the open use of intoxicants in religious settings, defenders would simply point to the mythology and ask a question that had no good answer. If the Lord Shiva himself partakes, if the greatest of all gods uses this plant to maintain his meditation, how can it possibly be wrong for his devotees to follow his example? No king dared to forbid what was so thoroughly woven into the fabric of faith, what had been sanctified by thousands of years of tradition and millions of practitioners. Yet the tolerance had its limits, its boundaries that were understood if not always clearly articulated. Those who used too much, who let cannabis dominate their lives to the point where they could no longer function or contribute to society, were seen as having lost their way, as drifting away from the discipline and self-control that spiritual practice required. Too little use, on the other hand, might suggest a lack of devotion or an unwillingness to fully surrender to the divine, a holding back that prevented true spiritual progress. As with all sacred things, balance was everything, the middle path that Buddhism taught about, the moderation that allowed one to use the plant's power without being consumed by it. To find that perfect measure, to know exactly how much to take and when and in what context, was itself seen as a kind of wisdom, as evidence that one had learned to live in harmony with forces that could help or harm depending on how they were approached. Travelers from other lands, merchants and missionaries, and eventually colonizers, wrote with fascination tinged with disapproval about India's relationship with cannabis, about the calm intoxication that seemed to pervade certain segments of society. They saw people moving slowly through their days, with eyes half closed and smiles faint but sincere, exhibiting a kind of peace that seemed alien to the goal-driven, productivity-obsessed mindset of European culture. Travelers from other lands, merchants and missionaries and eventually colonizers, wrote with fascination tinged with disapproval about India's relationship with cannabis, about the calm intoxication that seemed to pervade certain segments of society. They saw people moving slowly through their days, with eyes half closed and smiles faint but sincere, exhibiting a kind of peace that seemed alien to the goal-driven, productivity-obsessed mindset of European culture. It was not the wild drunkenness they knew from taverns and alehouses, not the loud aggression and loss of control that characterized alcohol intoxication in their own societies, but rather a measured stillness that seemed to erase pain without inducing pleasure, to bring contentment without excitement. The plant's reputation began to spread beyond India's borders through these accounts, though its meaning was almost always lost in translation, filtered through cultural assumptions that had no framework for understanding how a drug could be both sacred and commonplace, both spiritually significant and practically useful. What for the Indian sadhu was a tool of prayer and path to enlightenment, for the British colonial observer was simply another example of Eastern decadence and spiritual confusion, proof that these cultures needed the firm guidance of Western rationality and Christian morality to save them from their own confused philosophies. I find it strangely beautiful that what others viewed with suspicion or contempt, what outsiders saw as evidence of moral weakness or philosophical error, the practitioners themselves experienced as connection, as a direct link to something divine that transcended words and concepts, as peace itself made tangible through chemistry and ritual. The ritual surrounding bong endured for millennia with remarkably little change, passed down through generations as carefully as the sacred texts themselves. During religious processions, devotees carried clay cups of the drink through crowded streets, chanting the name of Shiva as they drank, their voices rising together in a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, deep and rhythmic and hypnotic. The mixture varied from region to region, each area having its own traditional recipe, its own preferred proportions of cannabis to milk to spices, but the essential elements remained constant: The cannabis leaves ground to paste, the milk to carry it, the spices to make it palatable, the prayers to make it sacred. It was a recipe for transcendence that could be made in any home with ingredients available to even the poorest families. A democratization of spiritual experience that made enlightenment theoretically accessible to everyone regardless of wealth or status or education. Elders taught the young not to fear the plant but to respect it, to approach it with the same reverence one would show to any powerful force, to understand that it was like fire or the ocean, capable of great benefit but also great harm if treated carelessly or arrogantly. The teaching was passed down through participation rather than lecture, through the experience of taking bong together during festivals and ceremonies, through watching how the adults in one's life related to the plant with a mixture of familiarity and respect. Even now, in remote villages where modernity has penetrated slowly if at all, the preparation of bong continues quietly and largely unchanged by time. The same rituals performed in the same way they have been for countless generations. The pestle grinding the leaves in the mortar, the milk slowly mixed in, the prayers whispered over the mixture, the offering made before consumption. All of it preserved as carefully as any museum piece, but alive and functional, still serving the same purpose it served 1,000 years ago. Beyond its spiritual role, cannabis served intensely practical purposes that had nothing to do with religion or philosophy. In the brutal heat of the Indian summer, when temperatures climbed to levels that made physical labor almost impossible and heat stroke was a constant danger, bong cooled the body in ways that went beyond mere temperature regulation. It made the heat feel less oppressive, made the exhaustion feel less crushing, made it possible to continue working when every instinct screamed to stop and rest. Laborers who could not afford medicine or doctors found in bong a relief that was within their means, something they could make themselves or buy for a few coins at any market. It dulled the pain of injuries and chronic conditions, slowed racing thoughts that prevented sleep, gave endurance to bodies pushed beyond what should have been endurable. For the poor, who made up the vast majority of India's population throughout its history, cannabis was not a luxury or an indulgence, but the closest thing to medical care they would ever receive, the only intervention between themselves and suffering that many would ever know. For the wealthy, who had access to doctors and imported medicines and all the comforts that money could buy, bong was something different, a doorway to meditation and introspection, a tool for the kind of spiritual exploration that required leisure and freedom from the immediate pressures of survival. The presence of bong in Indian culture across all these contexts, from the highest philosophical discussions to the most desperate attempts to ease physical pain, demonstrates something profound about how deeply humans can merge faith and chemistry, spirituality and medicine, the search for meaning and the search for comfort. It was a prayer one could drink, a ritual that required no temple or priest or holy book, a direct connection to the divine that could be accessed by anyone with access to the plant and the knowledge of how to prepare it. It offered connection to the gods for those who sought enlightenment, calm to the weary for those who needed rest, unity to the crowds who gathered for festivals, a sense of belonging in a world that often felt fragmented and hostile. No law or empire or colonial power could fully erase it because it answered needs that were older than any civilization and deeper than any ideology. Needs that emerged from the fundamental conditions of human existence: the need for relief from pain, the need for hope in the face of suffering, the need to believe that life contained more than just struggle and eventual death. India's sacred herb stands as perhaps history's longest continuous human relationship with cannabis, spanning thousands of years without any significant interruption, surviving invasions and famines and the rise and fall of countless kingdoms and empires. It was not a phase or a trend or an experiment, but a permanent feature of the cultural landscape, as integral to Indian civilization as the rivers that watered the crops or the monsoons that brought life-giving rain. The relationship was not about rebellion against authority, not about escaping reality or rejecting social norms, but about finding a way to live within reality's harshness, to make peace with suffering that could not be eliminated, to maintain faith in the face of evidence that suggested faith was foolish. It proved that intoxication and holiness need not be enemies, but could be twins born from the same fundamental longing, the longing to transcend the limited and painful experience of being trapped in a body, to glimpse something larger and more beautiful than the everyday struggle for survival. The faith that surrounded cannabis in India transformed a simple plant into a doorway to heaven, made a weed into a sacrament, turned chemistry into theology. From the hymns of the Vedas to the streets filled with colored powder during Holi, from temples clouded with incense to homes where families prepared the drink together, cannabis lived as part of the people's heartbeat, as natural and necessary as breath itself. But while India drank its peace in temples and celebrated with bhang in the streets, another land would soon discover the same plant through very different circumstances, would burn it not for transcendence, but for something raw and immediate, for purification after violence, for cleansing after the horror of battle. In the desert winds of Africa and across the vast plains beyond India's borders, in lands where different gods were worshipped and different philosophies governed life, cannabis smoke would rise for very different reasons, carrying different meanings, serving different purposes, adding new chapters to the long and complicated story of humanity's relationship with this plant that seemed to offer whatever each culture needed most.